Welcome everyone to the WENP Forum. I'm absolutely delighted that you can join us online today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Selina Gray and I have the privilege of chairing the West of England Nature Partnership. In my day role, I'm a public health academic at University of West of England in Bristol. WENP is a cross-sector partnership working to restore the natural environment in the West of England through embedding the value of nature in decision-making across spatial planning, public health and economic development. Our last WENP Forum was in June 2019 when we launched the Nature Recovery Network for the West of England. That feels a long time ago. So much that has happened in the last year has brought home to us in a very visceral and immediate way the importance of nature and the environment to our health and well-being, and the urgent need to take action to address the ecological and climate change emergency. So it's exciting today to be here together to inspire ourselves, to re-energise, and to hear about the work that is happening in the West of England to make the vision of the Nature Recovery Network a reality in this wonderful part of the work where we live. I'd just like to say a big thank you to the Natural History Consortium who are helping us run this event. So I'm really delighted to welcome our first contribution from Benedict Macdonald. Ben will be known to many of you as the author of the inspirational book Rebirding, which in September of this year won the Richard Jefferies Prize and the Wainwright Prize for Global Conservation Writing. He is a conservation writer, producer in wildlife television and naturalist, passionate about restoring Britain's wildlife. He has worked on television for projects for BBC, ITV, Netflix and Apple, including Sir David Attenborough's Our Planet on Netflix, which was awarded 2 Emmys in 2019. He has local roots, born in South Gloucestershire and is based in Bristol. Although hoping to be with us in person, he has had unexpected work commitments at short notice, as you'd expect in the field he's in. And so we're now delighted to share his presentation, which was pre-recorded at the end of last week on video. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Ben Macdonald. I'm the author of Rebirding and I'm a Bristol resident. And it's a pleasure to be talking to you all today. I think even in the most urban areas, we have extraordinary opportunities, even in the smallest of green spaces, to turn around an enormous nature recovery in the West of England. And, you know, whether that's combating ecological tidiness disorder by leaving our hedgerows gloriously tall and scruffy, whether that's cutting meadows later, whether that's joining up hedgerows and woodlands, there's an enormous amount that we can do on our doorstep that will lead to significant nature recovery beyond what many of us might even imagine. But in this talk, I'd like to take you through some of the big picture visions for rewilding that I hope can inspire us and take us on that journey together. So the good news is that the impending mass extinction of our wildlife, which we do face, is completely avoidable, and here's why. Only 6% of our country is built upon. 83% of us live in urban areas. That's a much higher percentage than in many parts of the world, giving us places larger than the Masai Mara and Yellowstone in the United Kingdom, albeit not necessarily in the West of England, for epic acts of large-scale nature restoration. So we have a fundamental contradiction in our country whereby we have more nature-loving voices than the lobbies that oppose nature, and yet we have ostensibly the worst and most depleted wildlife on the continent, and we have been the slowest to restore keystone species like the beaver. So why are we talking about wildlife decline if so many of us love it? So let's take the long view of how we got here in order to work out how we can get back to a much better place. The vast majority of our animals are shaped not by the actions of people in an evolutionary sense, but the actions of animals, many of which we have entirely forgotten. Not only were there the enormous glacial periods, but there were the interglacial periods when species like straight-tusked elephants and birds like shrikes, which are elephant evolved, would have been living in the United Kingdom as well. And once upon a time, hippos, elephants, rhinos, and of course the meso herbivores like aurochs and bison later on would have played a profound role in shaping the avifauna and the fauna of the United Kingdom. We need to remember, therefore, what is natural and what is not. A dense canopy woodland is what forms in the absence of giant animals. That doesn't necessarily make it natural. It simply means that the large animals have been removed over time, removed from the landscape, and also removed from our consciousness as well. This is the Latea forest in the Danube Delta. This is as close to a natural woodland landscape at the large scale that it's possible to see. And as you can see, it resembles in many ways the New Forest. It's the interplay of free-roaming horses and cattle with the formation of trees. What you get is a mosaic landscape. You keep the grasslands and the woodlands and the scrublands. You get something that it is very hard to design once those keystone animals are taken out of the picture. Natural landscapes are broken, chaotic, shifting, and cyclical. They are not continuous habitats, which is why in some ways early forms of farmland can actually be extraordinarily beneficial, for example, in places like Romania, because you have that broken landscape. The herbivore is eminently more disruptive than any four-legged animal. The herbivore is ourselves, but acting in ways that replicate natural processes. But look at these landscapes here. We have the Serengeti, we have the Bieszczba marshes in Poland, we have Karna National Park in India, and we have the Knepp Estate here in Britain, in Sussex, where natural processes are at work. You get something that is broken, chaotic, and diverse, and that is what we need to be working towards in nature restoration in the years to come. A lot of these species, a lot of our birds in particular, the hawfinch used to breed in west of England, I don't believe does anymore, tied to a very varied landscape with fruit trees, with shade-loving trees, light-loving trees. The humble robin, of course, still doing very well in Bristol, tied to mammalian disturbance, traditionally wild boar, and now ourselves. So many of our birds have evolved in a chaotic and broken landscape, and we need to be mindful of that when we're talking about blanket categories of habitats like woodland, grassland. The whole point is all of those habitats are designed to coexist and to intermingle. Early prototypes of RSPB, or indeed Wildlife Trust, or indeed any site managers: elk, wild cattle, horses, boar, red deer, other species of deer, of course, and bison. Species that would have contested the growth of vegetation and created something more open and more diverse than simply a blanket canopy woodland. But this is particularly relevant to any of us living alongside the River Severn, for example, is that we have to remember that before we tamed and drained rivers, Somerset and indeed areas of North Somerset would have looked like this. This is the Pripyat marshes in Belarus, the largest pristine, intact river wetland system in Europe. And the river is still very much in charge. Now, we can't even imagine what that landscape would have looked like in Britain. We have to look to other countries. But when we think about wetland restoration, again, we're not just talking about blanket reed bed. We're talking about allowing rivers to do what rivers are supposed to do in order to shape the land to maximal advantage. So allowing the river to expand, to contract, allowing beavers, of course, to aid that process. And, we're talking about wetland woodlands, home to species like black stork, which we know were present in Britain in Roman times. And of course, we're talking about species like Dalmatian pelican, capable of exploiting these huge areas to find the fish that they need in order to survive. All of these creatures would at some point, certainly in the Roman era, and in the beaver's case later, have been living in the west of England. The Dalmatian pelican, the beaver, the ruff, and the spotted crake. Now, the beaver, of course, is a keystone species. The rough and the spotted crake are the beneficiaries of that keystone species. They can only inhabit shallow wetlands in order to breed and nest successfully. Of course, the beaver is the very best creator of such habitats. So in order to bring back what we have lost, it can be a daunting and terrifying task if we don't break it down into a number of more workable stages. Stages that we can all think about working in small areas, not just in, enormous areas like, Snowdonia, the Norfolk Broads, or of course the Scottish Highlands. So the first problem that we need to address is one that is very difficult to see because it isn't there. And you might think that's a very strange thing to say, but here we have two pictures. We have an eastern Polish riverside farm at the top, and we have a sort of conventional UK cattle herding landscape at the bottom. The difference lies in food, or in our country, the lack of food for wild animals to eat. We have pumped our cattle so full of avermectins that the very ground is sterilized. Dung beetles cannot exist in most modern cattle fields in this country. Of course, in Poland, they have no such problem. Without deep ploughing the soil, of course, you have the formation of anthills. You have cutworms in the ground that feed starlings, the anthills feed wrynecks, the ground invertebrates feed yellow wagtails. So even a farmland environment can be home to an extraordinary abundance and diversity of life, but only if it is mimicking the natural processes that once existed. Once you reach the intensive chemical stages of farming, all of those species that you will see commonly on a Polish farm, wryneck, redback shrike, are not only extinct in farmland in the United Kingdom, but they are extinct in the United Kingdom, period. So, food for thought. We need to think about quite how many insects birds like cuckoos need in order to survive at all. And on average, a single pair of cuckoos needs in excess of 22,000 caterpillars to get through the course of summer. But of course, cuckoos cannot exist as island populations, as we're finding in the west of England. If you have one cuckoo or two cuckoos, it's not enough. You need a lot of cuckoos in one place. And indeed, the last cuckoo stronghold that I'm aware of, ironically, is the scrubland of Oldbury Power Station, where you have an enormous supply of invertebrate food, as well as reed warblers in which the cuckoo places its nest. But to have a population of cuckoos in a landscape, you need more like 2 million caterpillars. And we should always be looking at our landscapes and our habitat plans with a view to food, to feeding the birds that we love and want to protect, not with bird feeders, but with the habitats that create the invertebrates that these species need in order to survive. Where possible, we should always look to bring back animals that can do the job for us. Obviously, the return of the wild boar to the Forest of Dean has seen a much more diverse landscape emerge. More wallows, more little pools for amphibians, more broken areas, more orchids, more butterflies because of the flowers growing in the wake of the boar. We've become very human-centric in conservation, and in my view, we need to get back to remembering which animals, beavers being a classic one for the west of England, do the job even better than we do. Where possible, and this can be a challenge, especially in the west of England, we need to think about scale. This, for example, shows how cuckoos are surviving on Dartmoor. They are surviving in a large area as a large population. Often fragmentary populations, island populations, are already doomed to die out. So if possible, we should always be trying to concentrate our money and our resources in the areas that join up, whether that is simply a corridor beside a motorway, a railway line, connecting woodlands via hedgerows. It doesn't really matter what the shape of the landscape is, but it does matter that it is connected. The final thing we need to remember is that birds often are unable to recolonize by themselves due to the complexities of something known as natal homing, which I go into detail in Rebirding, Chapter 6. And basically, you know, we are not going to see black terns, wrynecks, redback shrikes, or Dalmatian pelicans recolonizing the west of England, because they weren't born there and therefore they don't know to migrate there in summer to breed. Which means that we need to move avian science forwards enormously in order to be able to reintroduce these species. You know, it's no good creating these wonderful landscapes that look nice, that are biodiverse, if we're not actively putting species back into them, whether that's the stag beetle, the wryneck, the swallowtail butterfly, of course, all of which could be doing very well in the south, all of which could be doing well in the west of England in the future, but not without human intervention for the good. One thing we should always be thinking about is not just being happy with trees. Oh, somebody's planted a woodland, that's a good idea. We need to be far more critical in looking at those woodlands and asking ourselves, are these simply timber crops? Most of the Forest of Dean is a timber crop. It is not a functional woodland. This is why we're seeing so many woodland bird extinctions in the Forest of Dean. It's not an absence of trees, it's an absence of the right trees in the right configuration, of maturity, of diversity, of fruiting species, of species like willow and birch that may not necessarily have commercial importance, but should nonetheless be in the landscape. And, you know, in my view, the Forestry Commission, as our largest landowner, and many private forestry companies have an obligation to be planting in a much more eco-friendly way. So we're talking no to spruce, yes to more pine potentially, and birch in particular. And of course, you know, we do need our some of our woodlands do need to be commercial, but we also need woodlands that are simply there for biodiversity and ecotourism as well. Otherwise, keystone species, willow, oak, birch, crabapple, hawthorn, blackthorn, are going to be increasingly absent from the landscape. And those are species of tree that come with a whole host of specialist birds attached. And until we put back that more jumbled, chaotic woodland landscape, we are going to continue to see catastrophic woodland bird declines in the UK, which remain by far the worst in Europe. It's not just about planting trees, it's about planting the right trees. One thing that I suggested in Rebirding is that we split our woodlands into two. We obviously need areas of high productivity pine, and if we must, spruce woodland for timber, but that we also have forests that are driven from ecotourism and from and are seen as sinks of biodiversity in their own right. Forests where beavers and boar are left in charge, whether that's in very large enclosures or ideally not in any enclosures at all. And this is the kind of aspiration that we need. It all sounds far-fetched, but you've got to remember we are simply talking about what Germany, Estonia, Poland have done decades ago. The widespread restoration of beavers in the United States began in the 1940s. So we are very behind. We need to acknowledge that, and we need to constantly think about not dwelling on the obstacles to nature restoration, but working out how we can proactively push it forwards, you know, and catch up with the rest of Europe. So a final slide showing, you know, what a woodland could be and what a woodland shouldn't be, in my view. The top we will have all have seen in the west of England, the dark, shady, single species plantation. The bottom is one of the northern stretches of the New Forest, you know, one of the most beautiful woodlands that we have left. And you'll see an extraordinary jumble of trees. The formations are varied and diverse. They're free growing in sunlight. They're growing where they want to grow. And this is not the result of planting trees. This is the result of regeneration over, you know, in the case of the New Forest, hundreds of years. So we must always be looking to create places that can grow themselves. Places like Even the scrublands of Oldbury Power Station, still one of the most diverse places that I know in the west of England, absolutely hooching with birds. You know, chaotic scrubland that is allowed to develop by itself. Woodland that regenerates by itself, grasslands that are governed by the actions of small herds of grazing animals, rivers that are governed by the actions of beavers. And it's that level of aspiration that we are going to need if we are going to genuinely turn the dire fortunes of wildlife in this country around.
Ben, I think we would all wish to say a huge thank you for that enormously thought-provoking and stimulating presentation. I think some of the areas we picked up last year in the conference about the need to create complexity and dynamism in our ecosystems and not just larger and connected were really iterated there. I think it's left us with challenges both to work at our own local level but also at scale and pace in the west of England. I'd like to hand over now to Stuart Gardner to talk about the work that WENP's been doing since the last forum. Stuart joined us last July when Heather Elgar, who had done an enormous amount of work to launch the Nature Recovery Network, moved on to take up a post at the Woodland Trust. Stuart's come from a very different background, working in partnership work in the aviation industry and then moving on via an MSc in technology to take up this post with WENP. We're really delighted to see those partnership skills being applied in a different setting. And as we were saying only yesterday, I think he's one of the few people who's moved from aviation to conservation and perhaps taken a more secure job at this particular moment in time. So good timing, Stuart, and I'd like to hand over to you now.
Thank you very much, Selina. Hi all and welcome. Thank you for joining the WENP conference. I'm just going to be talking for 10 minutes on the work WENP's done in the past year and some of the key pieces of work that we're doing at the moment to progress the Nature Recovery Network, following on from Ben's talk, which I found really inspirational actually. So I pre-recorded a few slides, so I'm just going to be handing over to myself a week ago. But if you do have any questions, do pose them in the event chat, and that means I can answer them live. So the vision of the Nature Partnership is for a thriving and well-connected natural environment in the west of England that underpins a healthy and resilient society and economy. So in order to achieve that vision, we have two main work streams, one of which is nature recovery and one of which is nature and health. So the two are very much interrelated, and these two work streams really frame our work. Last year at the WENP conference in 2019, we presented a West of England Nature Recovery Network. So this was building on the Lawton report in 2010, which was stating that wildlife was suffering from a lack of habitat of sufficient size that is well connected. So we need bigger, better, more and more joined up habitats. So in the West of England, we've had declines in wildlife such as starlings and swifts falling by 96% between 1994 and 2014. So really severe declines. The government has a 25-year environment plan commitment to develop a nature recovery network, which is an expanded, improved, increasingly connected network of places across England that are richer in wildlife, help recover our species, and are more resilient to climate change and other pressures. So this West of England Nature Recovery Network attempts to address this on a local scale or regional scale. So it's a joined up network of marine and terrestrial habitats where nature and people can thrive. It's showing where our best quality habitats are in dark colours on this screen, and also how that habitat is functionally connected and where a strategic network is where we should be focusing our resources in order to create this resilient ecological network, connect up our existing high quality habitat. So this is something that's been framing our work over the last year. One of the key pieces of work over the last year has been the publication of the West of England Joint Green Infrastructure Strategy for 2020 to 2030. So this is owned by the West of England Combined Authority and the 4 unitary authorities in the area, with the aim of securing investment in GI, green infrastructure, planning and provision, similar to that of other infrastructure such as transport. So this enables a consistent strategic approach to green infrastructure across the West of England and has an action plan for the Combined Authority, local authorities and partners to deliver this vision in the next 10 years. So coming out of this, we're developing strategic GI projects to deliver across the 8 GI outcomes that are mentioned in the strategy, one of which is supporting resilient ecosystems and biodiversity. So within this strategy, we have the nature recovery network has been used as a key piece of work, a key piece of evidence, and the GI strategy will be key in facilitating delivery of the nature recovery network. So one of the actions is for the nature recovery network to be used by local authorities to identify opportunities for ecological enhancement through their local plans and strategies. And one of the GI outcomes is resilient ecological network. There is now work going on to develop strategic green infrastructure projects, and the nature recovery network, alongside other pieces of evidence, of course, is being used to inform those strategic projects in the west of England. Coming out of the GI strategy and also from the 25-year environment plan, where there's expected to be a mandate in the environment bill for 10% biodiversity net gain on all development sites. That's saying that each development should be delivering 10% net gain, delivering more for biodiversity than it takes away. So in the west of England, there has been some guidance developed for the 4 local authorities, which is to be agreed still. But the idea is that biodiversity net gain needs to be embedded in local plans and development management to ensure that the increasing housing that we need in the region delivers for biodiversity and doesn't detract from it. So we need to agree an approach to biodiversity net gain, because it can be delivered on site. I think that's the ideal, is you deliver biodiversity net gain on site. But there may be funding available from biodiversity net gain to deliver strategic habitat creation off site. So the nature recovery network that I just mentioned could be used to prioritise the delivery of biodiversity net gain in a nature recovery network by weighting habitat creation in the network more favourably, and to deliver the habitat creation needed to address connectivity issues in the network. So that's something that we will need to work very closely with local authorities on, the approach to integrating nature recovery network into net gain going forwards. One of the other key pieces of work coming out as an action in the GI strategy was a need for a tree and woodland strategy for the west of England. So there's also a lot of momentum behind planting trees, creating woodlands at the moment to address the challenge of climate change. But there's also a lot of other things that trees and woodland can deliver, including for nature, for flood management, for water quality. So what we need is a strategy that ensures all that tree planting, woodland creation that's going to take place delivers for nature and other ecosystem services by putting the right tree in the right place. So this is something we've been producing through WENP in partnership, and the Forest Haven Trust has been leading on the content. We have the structure of the document will be an intro, it's still in development, and then the strategy, a vision for West of England's trees and woodlands, and an action plan in the next 5 years to deliver that, as well as an evidence base for our trees and woodlands, principles for tree and woodland planting and management to ensure it's done in the right way to deliver across all ecosystem services and maximise natural capital, and then priorities for trees and woodlands across the region according to local character areas, so showing according to each area what the priorities of trees and woodlands are in that area. We're planning to release the full document in 2021 with an event to explain in more detail its purpose and how it's produced, and to release an executive summary alongside the principles in the autumn. It will also be key if we're going to deliver a nature recovery network to engage the agricultural sector, given that over 70% of land in the west of England, and indeed across the whole of England, is under agricultural management. There's a change in agricultural policy at the moment from the European policy of largely direct subsidies towards an ELM scheme, an environmental land management scheme. So public money, subsidies being put towards delivering public goods, including for nature. That's going to be in 3 tiers, and the third of those tiers is about large-scale nature-based projects, and the second about local and regional priorities. So there's a question around how we ensure that the nature recovery network can be used to inform that local regional prioritization, ensure we're engaging with the agricultural sector to make sure that our work strategically in the west of England is joined up with agriculture. We're not pulling in different directions. So together with the Bristol Haven Catchment Partnership, we've set up an agriculture working group for the west of England to ensure those links are there with the agriculture working group and to explore those questions. Other areas that will be key for delivering nature recovery network are, of course, the areas of outstanding natural beauty in the regions, which are incredibly important ecologically at the moment. So last year, the AONBs collectively declared that they would develop nature recovery plans for each AONB with the aim of delivering at least 100,000 hectares of wildlife-rich habitat within the AONBs going forwards. So what we're doing now is working with the AONBs to ensure that the West of England Nature Recovery Network is integrated within those nature recovery plans. So that's key to ensure there's a joined up approach, and we're ensuring that the AONBs are linking more widely into the landscape and creating those resilient ecological corridors that we need in the West of England. It's also obviously incredibly important that we work together with stakeholders across the region, with landowners across the region, to ensure that the Nature Recovery Network and the need to address the ecological emergencies is integrated into people's land management. So that could be, for instance, from utility companies to Highways England Network Rail managing their verges for nature, acting as artificial corridors almost, to landowners such as universities and hospitals, encouraging them to manage their land in a way that delivers the nature recovery network. And I think the Bristol Ecological Emergency really speaks to that need to engage, the Ecological Emergency Strategy, speaks to that need to engage stakeholders across the whole of West England to ensure everyone is acting to implement that nature recovery network and address that ecological emergency. What has become increasingly apparent is that there is a need to blend private and public finance to deliver for nature recovery. And in order to attract private and public investment, we need to have investable projects that enable financing of nature-based solutions. So something we're working on at the moment is to identify key strategic projects for the nature recovery network in the form of a prospectus, so that we know which projects are ongoing and that are conceptual that could be developed to deliver for nature and could be financed to do that. So we're developing this prospectus, and the idea is that we identify these projects, and then the ones that need working up, we can work up to become shovel ready, investment ready. So when investment does become available for nature recovery, either from public or private sources, we have those projects almost ready to go. And we're also working to develop some mechanisms to facilitate private financing together with public financing of nature-based projects. So that's something that's being actively explored across a couple of avenues in the west of England, and hopefully there'll be more news on that in the near future. Lastly, our nature and health work stream. So as I said, nature recovery needs to go hand in hand with people's recovery, and the two are very much interconnected, ensuring people are engaged in nature and therefore act to restore it, and in restoring their health as well, especially pertinent with, of course, the COVID crisis. Now, I won't talk to this for too long because we did have a nature and health webinar held in June. That recording is on the WENP website, if you want to explore that in more detail. But our work is effectively guided by this WENP nature and health strategy for the west of England, and the focus on that is on mainstreaming nature-based health services within the mainstream healthcare, the health and care sector. So that can be through social prescribing link workers to ensure that commissioners, GPs are aware of what services are out there. And we have a practitioner network in the west of England, which WENP helps to support. And that brings together practitioners who work in nature and health to help them develop standards, to share experiences and learning, all within that aim of facilitating that mainstreaming of nature-based health services.
So thank you very much for listening there. Apologies for the slight technical hitch at the start, which was caused by me moving my mouse and moving a slide forward. If you have any questions on the presentation, do get in touch via the chat, obviously, or otherwise, info@wenp.org.uk is the email address. Get in touch via Twitter, the Twitter handle is there, or via the website, of course.
Hello, I'm Andrew Grant, Chair of the Bathscape Landscape Partnership, and I want to briefly introduce Bathscape, which aims to reconnect people and communities with Bath's unique landscape setting. The Bathscape area covers 101 square kilometres. It lies at the southern end of the Cotswolds ONB, and it provides the landscape setting for Bath's World Heritage Site, which is represented by that red line in the middle. You will also see there's a number of other significant landscape designations, which make this an incredibly rich landscape place to review and to work with. It's incredibly green. Almost 80 square kilometres of the Bathscape area are represented by natural features, including woodlands, grasslands, river corridors, commons, and the like. And the project is quite unique in that it basically embraces the city and its setting. It's not just about the landscape perimeter, it's about how the landscape engages with the whole built environment. And the partnership board came about out of a common concern, really, to how do we look after the future of this amazing landscape setting. So we have a number of very significant organisations engaged with the Bathscape project, including Bath North East Somerset Council, Avon Wildlife Trust, the National Trust, the two universities, the Woodland Trust, the Bath Preservation Trust, the Cotswolds Conservation Board itself, Wessex Water, Visit Bath, Bath Residents, and Bath City Forum. So wide range of people very concerned and engaged with how do we look after our future landscape. And Bathscape has not been an easy journey in terms of how to get to where we are at the moment. In 1987, UNESCO inscribed the City of Bath as a World Heritage Site, explicitly citing the green setting and natural environment amongst the criteria. So that led in 2009 to a series of studies that started to look at what do we need to sort of conserve, what's important to the future setting of this World Heritage Site. And landscape and views and character was a very significant aspect of that. In 2013, the Bathscape Partnership Board was established to deliver a coordinated approach to the care of the area, and they submitted a Stage 1 bid to the Heritage Lottery Fund, which eventually in 2016 led to approval for a 15-month development stage and some pilot projects. Finally, in 2018, a full Stage 2 application was successful, leading to the project winning 2.2 million to be spent over 5 years, running from 2018 to 2023. In those pilot stages, it was significant that we started to look at what is the character of this city, how do we properly map the assets that we have. So some serious analysis was done into the landscape character zoning, the ecological richness, the geology, and some of the cultural heritage of the place. And it brought out, just the depth of richness that we have to work with here. Significant people through history, really significant examples of different habitat types from grasslands to woodlands. Amazing heritage and archaeology that carves its way up through the landscape. And stories of individual species which are particular to the place, and stories of individual people who have enriched the cultural heritage of this landscape over many, many years. So where are we now? Basically, we're into the second year of this significant project, and we're starting to deliver some of the 25 projects that were set up, structured around some key themes. Conserving and restoring the landscape, the therapeutic landscape, which builds on Bath's heritage as a place to come and be healed, be engaged with the quality of the landscape experience, providing better access to this landscape, and providing training and skills and understanding of what is the landscape. So in no particular order, some quick summaries of some of these projects. Conserving and restoring, perhaps particularly relevant to the Nature Recovery Network. Some key headline targets: to improve management of 80 hectares of woodland, similarly 100 hectares of grasslands, to manage and create 30 important viewpoints of the city and its landscape, to create 12 new flower-rich meadows, to survey 10 key archaeological sites so we can better start to understand this amazing sort of history of this landscape, and to provide an advisory service for landowners in terms of how they might best manage their meadows and their woodlands for the future. The therapeutic landscape has also been a very significant start, beginning to engage with the local population and people through events in parks, through using art and interventions and interactive experiences. The Bathscape Walking Festival has been particularly successful in bringing people out and engaging with landscape in different ways. And beginning to look at landscape on prescription, which is clearly a really important aspect of how we think about better health and well-being in the landscape. Access to this landscape is critically important, and it's been really proven over the last few months that how much people really enjoy and have enjoyed getting out into the landscape, which brings pressures on how do we manage some of these pathways and routes which perhaps haven't been that used previously. So there's a whole series of projects which are looking to this, and perhaps the biggest one in the short term is to create a 20-mile circular path around the whole city, which will provide an extraordinary array of views and experiences for people to really experience this landscape, and always connecting back into the city centre. So we have this in and out engaging with the core populations and getting people out into the landscape. And as part of that, basically, how do we really sort of engage people in lots of different ways? At one level, how do we teach people new skills, tree planting, pathway repairs, wall repairs, all those sort of simple aspects? How do we teach them and get them to understand some of the nature conservation stories? How do we get people engaged in volunteering in terms of helping people on projects or just taking people into the landscape on guided walks? Many sort of themes here, and obviously as part of this we're building up our information, trying to transfer that to people via websites, through interviews, through films and through social media and the likes. Basically a massive public engagement project. And we started with the vision: the Bathscape scheme will ensure Bath and its setting are better recognised, managed and experienced as a landscape city, with the surrounding hills and valleys enhancing the World Heritage Site and actively enjoyed by all. We want a greater number and wider range of people to feel connected to their local landscape and inspired to explore the outstanding built and natural environments, improving health and well-being. And we feel we've made a very good start to that. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Liz Kinsey and I'm the Frome Reconnected Partnership Officer, a role which has been in place since summer 2018. I'm going to tell you about the Bristol Frome, which, in case you're not familiar with it, sits here, this grey shape that's overlaid on the West of England map. The catchment as a whole is 17,500 hectares of agricultural land, and it has about 4,000 kilometres of river. It starts in the Cotswolds and it flows down to the Bristol city centre. The Environment Agency has classified that into 8 different water bodies, and the status of these water bodies is reflected by that agricultural and urban land use, and as a result they're classified as from poor to moderate ecological status or potential. So this project was initiated from that knowledge by the Bristol Avon Catchment Partnership. They really were driving to have a strategic programme which would make improvements within that subcatchment. And the overall aim of the work is to join up and develop these resources so that we can work together to come up with some benefits for the whole catchment and the people who live within it. The vision for our work is to have a valued, healthy and resilient river and catchment, one in which nature thrives and communities can access and enjoy both now and in the future. And we will do this by collating existing data and evidence to ensure that the outcomes of the project are relevant and targeted, and that we can identify any missing information. We will also be identifying relevant funding streams and potential projects, but also importantly, improving communications between organisations and joining up and aligning the work packages so that we can have this overall benefit. Partners that fund the project are the Environment Agency, Bristol City Council and South Gloss, and Wessex Water and Bristol Avon Catchment Partnership have also contributed. Beyond that, we do have in-kind contributions from and support from people like the Farming and Wildlife Advisory Group, Bristol Avon Rivers Trust, and the Avon Frome Partnership, but also beyond the nature delivery partners such as Network Rail and Highways Authority. The project has been running since the summer of 2018 and will be funded until the summer or March of 2022 and hopefully beyond. So given that this is a nature recovery, there's a nature recovery focus here, what projects are we delivering? Well, Most recently, I've worked up a project called the Reconnected Tributaries, which will be focusing on sustainable agriculture, and I put a bid in there to the DEFRA Green Recovery Fund for this work. There are three separate projects delivering fish passage within the Frome, one in Yate, one at Nibley, and one which will cover 13 or 14 fish barriers down the midsection of the main river. There are two exciting redevelopment opportunities within Yate and in Bristol city centre at the Frome Gateway. And these projects will importantly explore options for main river restoration in both locations, which will benefit biodiversity, create quality green infrastructure for local communities, as well as hopefully also mitigating flood risk and improving climate resilience. There are also local level projects such as Goose Green Local Nature Reserve, where we're working with Section 106 funds, but also right up to the much more aspirational projects where we're working with Avon Wildlife Trust and exploring options to establish a publicly accessible flagship river reserve, which is a really exciting project which could be an exemplar site for nature conservation, public engagement and tourism. So what have we achieved? The River Frome objectives have been written into and recognised by the Joint Green Infrastructure Strategy, and the project is considered to be one of the top 6 delivery programmes for them. We are considered to be one of the delivery mechanisms for the local authority climate emergency plans in Bristol and South Gloucestershire. And we've been written into various prospectuses and portfolios of work by people like Avon Wildlife Trust and West of England Nature Partnership. This really helps give weight to the project, and it's helping us to gather positive momentum so that, having identified the framework for delivery, this portfolio of projects, we can start to chunk up the projects and start to deliver some of the baseline work towards the development of the project, so that as and when larger partnership or funding projects become available, we can really go for them and hopefully have a good chance at getting them. The River Frome Reconnected has already directly funded work on the Frome Gateway site, looking at options and constraints towards main river restoration, and similarly there will be a work done on Yate Master Plan. There's been some great partnership work done at Nibley, where we are jointly hoping to deliver some work on the ground in the next year, 18 months. And another example of partnership working which has come out of this project is looking at work that Farming and Wildlife Advisory Group, some survey work they did for the Environment Agency and South Gloucestershire Council, which has turned into an £80,000 worth project of working with natural processes interventions for the within the South Gloss area, supporting flood risk, local flood risk improvements and biodiversity gain. The River Frome Reconnected is also actively supporting partner organisations with project development and seeking funding for implementation. So what's next? Well, we've already created this story map, which will be launched shortly, and this is a much needed central resource which will highlight priority areas for targeted improvements. It will be helpful at community level to demonstrate what work is going on and how local projects fit in. It will help delivery partners understand where or how their future work should be targeted, but it will also help us to demonstrate at executive level where key investment might help unblock or facilitate broader benefits. Later on this year, we'll also be publishing a catchment plan, and there will be future much more targeted community engagement. Beyond that, we hope to continue aligning our work with the existing strategies such as the Joint Green Infrastructure Strategy and climate emergency work, and we will be delivering this pipeline of projects linking multiple partners and helping deliver nature recovery on the ground. If you would like to find out more information, please do get in touch with me. My contact details are here. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I'm Amy Coulthard and I'm the Director for Nature's Recovery at Avon Wildlife Trust. Welcome to the North Somerset Levels and Moors. An extensive area of coastal and floodplain grazing marsh adjacent to the Severn Estuary, the North Somerset Levels and Moors is full of opportunities to deliver a network of wetlands rich in nature. This is reflected in local strategic recovery plans for nature and water. With 3.5% of the UK's coastal and floodplain grazing marsh, the relatively small area of designations underestimates the value and importance of this area. Deep peatland in the Gordano Valley and around Nailsea is often overlooked. These former fens drained for agriculture are now suffering significant shrinkage and erosion, clearly visible where roads and pipelines sit well above the field level. This is an issue we must address as we face up to a changing climate. As a popular place to live and work, there is pressure on the landscape, with around 25,000 new homes proposed over the next 17 years. Already less than 8% of the area is managed for nature, and we are at a tipping point. Change is vital to address the climate and ecological crises we face. Over the last 5 years, a group of key partners and stakeholders have committed to make a step change in the area. Implementing a catchment-based approach, we have worked at a landscape scale and taken a collaborative and holistic approach to developing and delivering nature recovery projects. Over the last 5 years, these projects have been catalysts for real change and action on the ground. Projects have included the partnership itself, whose membership you can see on your screen, along with the Gordano Raised Water Levels and Lapwing projects, a small grant scheme which enabled landowners to effect change beyond the nature reserves, and water quality studies. These water quality studies have now been translated into a feasibility study and detailed design for a constructed wetland at Nailsea to provide a nature-based solution to surface water runoff. At present, 70% of the surface water runoff from Nailsea is going into side ditches and polluting peatlands. Projects have also supported local communities to connect with the levels and to be inspired to take action themselves. Some of the activities have included building and installing barn owl boxes in the Gordano Valley with a local school. With funding from the Bristol Avon Catchment Partnership, we are now moving to the final stage of a shared vision and action plan for the area, due to launch this autumn. This will be a long-term vision that we will deliver through a series of projects. The vision is simple: wetter, wilder, more welcoming waterways, but we intend for it to be more than a plan. We will restore and create large areas of resilient, dynamic, nature-rich wetland habitats. Nature's recovery will provide multiple benefits, including nature-based strategic solutions to water quality issues, flood risk management and climate change. Connectivity in the water environment is as vital as for other habitats. Renaturalised waterways will be reconnected to natural floodplains and barriers to fish movements will be removed. Natural capital across the region will be protected and enhanced. We can't do this alone, and the North Somerset Levels and Moors Partnership and private landowners will play a key role. Delivery starts this autumn with the Wilder Waterways project, which will focus on the Land Yeo River and applying the vision to enhance the natural capital of the Land Yeo and its surrounding landscape. But we don't want to stop there. We want our vision to cover the entire North Somerset Levels and Moors. And we already have projects ready to move from plans to action, including a project for a wilder Gordano, which will tackle water quality with nature-based solutions, extend the area of nature reserves, and improve access for visitors. We also want to move the new wetland at Nailsea from the planning and detailed design phase to the construction phase. This will enable us to deal with the long-standing issue of treating the surface water, as well as extending aquatic habitats rich in dragonflies and birds, and creating a place for people to enjoy nature on their doorstep. Supporting local communities is important too, particularly as they recover from the pandemic. And we will be providing nature-based wellbeing and citizen science activities, as well as supporting local landowners with advice and opportunities to collaborate to deliver on their own wetland projects under future agri-environment schemes. Continuing monitoring and evidence projects is also vital. We must demonstrate our impact and inspire other people to replicate our work and to inform future decision making. We are actively seeking funding for these projects, and like many of our partners, we are awaiting the outcome of the Green Recovery Challenge Fund, which we hope will help us accelerate delivery further. Thank you for your time this afternoon, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Hi everyone, my name is Savita Wilmot and I am CEO of the Natural History Consortium. So a big thanks to Stuart and everyone involved today for asking me to say a few words about the Bristol One City Ecological Emergency Strategy, which was launched just a couple of weeks ago and is freely available on the Bristol One City website. So I would really encourage you to go and have a look. I'm just going to touch on a couple of things in the plan so you know what is there. A real highlight is that the plan has come together very, very quickly. Ian Barrett, who many of you will know, really spearheaded this work, having a discussion with the Mayor in late 2019. And it was only then a couple of months before Bristol declared an ecological emergency in February of 2020, being the first UK city to do so. And very quickly on the back of that, the One City Environment Board commissioned the Ecological Emergency Strategy. And it's really thanks to organisations from across the city and beyond who gave up their time and expertise to begin to work together to create the strategy. And only a few weeks ago, on the 22nd of September, the Bristol One City Environment Board approved the Ecological Emergency Strategy. And now we are looking at what implementation will look like. So I have only got a few minutes, so I only wanted to just take you through some of the headlines of the report. So the report really concentrates on 4 areas: space for nature, pesticides, pollution, and our wider footprint. And you can see the first 3 have targets there. 30% of land in Bristol be managed for wildlife, reducing the use of pesticides in Bristol by about 50% by 2030, and 100% of Bristol's waterways to have water quality that supports healthy wildlife by 2030. And our wider footprint is a bit different. It's an ambition for people and businesses to reduce consumption of products undermining the health of wildlife and ecosystems around the world. So just to touch on each of those briefly to give you a bit more detail, and of course all of this is in the plan. Making space for nature is the first chapter, and amongst that really highlights the amount of land in Bristol that's already protected for wildlife, and really seeks to make the case that there is plenty of land in Bristol that can be managed for wildlife, and really that we can all play a part. The strategy aims to speak to individuals, organisations, businesses at all levels, and really acknowledges the challenge of doing so while meeting and working alongside all of the different strategies and targets that the city is also trying to accomplish. So in terms of action, the strategy really seeks to make it simple in terms of emphasising creating and protecting habitats, getting everyone involved, the need for a nature recovery network, and I'm sure there's lots of discussion of that here at WENP, and also touching on wildlife friendly food. So a bit quicker through the other three sections, but they're equally as important. The second is on pesticides and that target to reduce by 50% over the next 2 years. So the strategy gives some more details, but really acknowledging that many landowners and land managers, and that goes to individuals as well, are still using pesticides, and some people may not be aware of the impact on nature. So the strategy is asking everyone to help by creating a baseline, really creating that evidence base, and then starting to work together as a city to eliminate use. So there's a real need for sharing best practice. There's a communications and public engagement challenge right at the heart of that target. The third area, as I said, is around pollution. And really the strategy acknowledges that pollution can be very wide-ranging, from light pollution and noise pollution, but really focuses in on aquatic environments in particular as a starting point. So acknowledging that starting point asks us to think collectively, again at all levels, around infrastructure, tackling pollutions, really looking specifically at microplastics and microfibers, and continuing the work that has been ongoing for many years in Bristol around single-use plastics. So the fourth area around wider footprint, this is really around business and organization engagement as well as people. And the strategy really seeks to acknowledge that there is a growing body of information, and I would say business engagement schemes as well. But where some materials might be difficult to implement, also that in some cases the call to action or areas that businesses or organizations can make the most difference may not be clear. So the strategy really aims to set out some calls around procurement and sustainable sourcing policies with a particular emphasis on food waste, a section on investment, and then touching on standards for new housing development as well. So that's a very quick run through some of the headlines of the strategy, and I hope has whet your appetite for looking it up on the Bristol One City website. I'm sure we can put a link in as well, and it would be great to get your thoughts as we think about implementation. So Ian, Barrett, and myself and others involved at Bristol City Council are really starting to think through the detail now of what an implementation working group will be, but being really sensitive to that challenge, that it's not the job of an implementation working group to do all the implementation. The real challenge is how we make this a citywide project and a citywide effort across all 4 of our areas. We know we can't do everything at once, so there's a real need to create a phased program, starting with the most important actions first. And we've tried to set those out on the last page of the strategy, including the need for building evidence and really identifying the ecological networks where there's the greatest opportunity to make a difference first. There's a real opportunity for organizations to create their own action plans to put the strategy into place, and Bristol City Council has brought in a project officer to do that. Obviously resources, both financial but also time and willingness are going to be really important to accelerate progress on the plan. So if this is of particular interest, it would be great to hear more, and I look forward to hearing the other presentations. So thanks again to Stuart and everyone, and looking forward to more conversations today.
Welcome back, everyone. I hope you've enjoyed the interactive sessions on the different topics, the wide variety of presentations we've had today. We've now got a fantastic panel of people who are going to give us some reflections and opportunity about the event. We've got Paul Cottington from the NFU, we've got Guy Thompson from M-Trade, we've got Ian Barrett, who is Chief Exec of Avon Wildlife Trust, and we've got someone who's just disappeared off my screen from Bath. So I'm not quite sure who's going to kick off first, and I hope we've got Rachel from Natural England as well, who will be joining and contributing to this session in due course.
So I think I'm starting, Selina. Do I?
Yes, thank you, Ian. That's great.
Thank you. So I hope everyone can see the slide that I'm showing. So I've been asked to talk about accelerating nature's recovery and the role of NGOs or the Wildlife Trust in doing that. So I'm just going to quickly go through some reflections on what we need to do and the role that the Wildlife Trust can play in doing that. So hopefully you all know Avon Wildlife Trust. We're the main nature conservation charity dedicated in this area to bringing back wildlife, focus on nature's recovery and inspiring people to take action for wildlife. Got 17,000 members, 31 nature reserves, and we also work with people across the whole landscape to make them work for wildlife. So I think what we need to do, to boil it down to quite simple terms, because this is brief, is get more land managed for nature in a way which contributes to the Nature Recovery Network. So Stuart was talking about the Nature Recovery Network earlier. We need to be getting more land managed for wildlife, linking in with that. We need to make sure that the land more widely is managed sympathetically for wildlife. And we need to make sure that the development we've got going on in this area contributes to that instead of making things worse. They're quite simple at the heart of what we need to do. And it's a time of real opportunity for us at the moment. We know there's a few things in the pipeline. There's already the opportunity to do carbon offsetting through habitat creation. We're going to have net gain coming through, as Stuart mentioned earlier. There's lots of organisations with tree planting targets. So there's lots of potential funding streams which could provide money to invest in our natural environment, to create the habitats, those links that we need to. And the government have got a couple of big funding pots lined up, which the Green Recovery Fund is the first part of, which will provide funding for this going forward, again, as Stuart said. So we know what we need: more land, connecting the Nature Recovery Network, wider management, and there's potentially funding coming through to do it. The issue is one of the issues is when we build those habitats to make more space for nature and connect the Nature Recovery Network, how are those going to be protected in the long term? So we can get funding in for net gain and create the habitats, but what then happens with them? So the wildlife trusts are doing quite a lot in this area. We're looking to develop projects similar to the way that Stuart was talking about the WENP pipeline of projects. So that we're looking to do habitat restoration and creation, which creates those benefits, carbon offsetting, net gain credits. We can work with local authorities. We can work directly with developers and businesses who are looking to buy credits. We can combine different funding streams. We're interested in acquiring land so that we can create those habitats. And the benefits of working with the Wildlife Trust in doing that, of course, is that we will look after that land in perpetuity. So you don't have those issues about creating habitats and then them just falling into disrepair over the next, in 10, 15 years' time because they're not being managed properly. We're also looking at setting up our own wider solutions platform so that people can invest in those habitat creation and restoration projects to get those credits for carbon offsetting or biodiversity net gain. We want to work with landowners. We're working with landowners already on rewilding projects across the west of England, and we're keen to do more of that and work with farmers on nature-friendly farming, habitat improvement projects. Guy's going to talk a bit about the Bristol Avon catchment market, which we're trying to set up with Wessex Water to link up people who want to buy those credits with people who can provide the land and put the projects in place. And we've got our Building with Nature trademark benchmark, which is helping to advise developers and local authorities really high quality development. So that's a lot of different things we're doing to try to accelerate nature's recovery over the next 10 years and beyond. There's also, of course, the people side and the urban side. So as Savita's just been through the ecological emergency strategy for Bristol, which we led on putting together, and that whole builds on the My World City approach that the Trust pioneered in 2015. And we are looking to mobilise people as part of the ecological emergency strategy and nature's recovery. Historically, environmental NGOs have kind of run projects and taken out volunteers. Society's changing with people wanting to take action on all kinds of things. So we want to move from trying to manage everything to actually supporting and being alongside people in making that change. So we can get 1 in 4 people taking action for nature, whether that's, you know, communities in cities or farmers, whoever it is. You know, we want to empower and support everybody to make that change for nature. We're also launching a big campaign. We launched it at the end of September. This is our aspiration as Wildlife Trust nationally is for 30% of land to be managed for nature by 2030, and that's a staging post on the way to more land being managed for nature by 2050. And we launched a £30 million appeal at the end of September. We want to raise that money so we can buy more land to restore nature through nature reserves, more capacity to work with landowners on improving their land, and calling on the government to make the changes we need to legislation to back all of that up. So we've got a very wide-ranging and ambitious programme to try to support nature's recovery across the west of England and across the whole of the country. So that's it. That's a whole range of things that we're doing. There's a real offer there that, you know, we want to work with people who are putting all of these things in place, and we can help to manage and preserve sites in perpetuity to make sure we retain those gains for nature. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ian. Just one question so far from the chat box. Who should be owning the land?
I think there's a whole range of different things to work with that. I mean, the land is already owned by people. So, you know, we're very happy to work with the landowners who are interested in rewilding or habitat creation projects on their land. We are interested in purchasing more land. We're interested in acquiring land through legacies and gifts. So the Wildlife Trust, the NGOs, are never going to own 30% of the UK. We don't want to own 30% of the UK, but we do want to increase our land holdings so that we can do more for nature, as well as helping other people to improve theirs.
Thank you. We'll come to further questions later, but that seemed a very timely one given your presentation. Okay, I'm delighted to hand over now to Guy, who's going to give us his vision for accelerating investment in nature's recovery.
Right, can you hear me? Sorry, I had a glitch then. Yep, great, I'm on. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Selena. So it falls to me to present the kind of business case, the business pitch on nature recovery. And I've got a couple of opening kind of perspectives on that. One, a personal one. So whilst I'm here representing Wessex Water and Entrade, I began my career in the environmental NGO movement with the RSPB. And moved into a role as founding director of Natural England, and throughout my career have been dedicated to progressing these issues, but latterly come to the view that business has an incredibly powerful role to play in advancing the recovery of nature. And second perspective really builds on the recent context of the COVID-19 pandemic. We saw through the pandemic, some of the private providers of essential services like water, telecoms, the broadband providers stepping up to their regulated obligations. And the Prime Minister, after during the thick of the crisis, pointed to the need to rethink a vision for how society might work post-pandemic. So there's a real opportunity, I think, to think about the role of businesses in supporting the delivery of essential services and public goods to society as we start to think about how we can build back better post-pandemic. Now, at Wessex Water, we see an opportunity to deliver more for people, nature and the environment across our catchments. The government has an audacious goal to restore the environment within a generation, and I think most of the high-level architecture is in place to support the delivery of that goal, with the Environment and Agriculture bills before Parliament, a nature recovery network and local nature recovery strategies building. Some big funds now announced by government, the £640 million Nature for Climate Fund. But as the pandemic has illustrated, the public finances are stretched to their limit, and it's increasingly clear that the government's goal is unachievable with public funding and philanthropy alone. So there are two consequences from that conclusion to me. First of all, we need to make much more efficient use of regulated expenditure and public funding. For the water industry in England, £4.6 billion will be invested in environmental improvement over the next 5 years, the vast majority of which will be spent on very specific point source improvements to deliver quite narrow objectives, some of which come with perverse consequences for example, the carbon footprint of the industry and climate change. So yeah, Wessex Water, we see the opportunity to do things differently and propose innovative solutions to do more for the same cost. And I think the second consequence of my conclusion is that we need to find ways to attract private finance and develop mechanisms that turn national targets into integrated on-ground delivery of nature-based solutions. So how do we attract the private finance and investment to nature recovery is a subject that has been taxing me now over recent months as we've been thinking about how we accelerate a green economic recovery post-pandemic. And I was very closely involved in the publication of a piece of work by the Broadway Initiative just back in July, looking at this issue of how we can build and create markets in nature recovery that accelerate the delivery of that very audacious government goal. Our conclusion is that it's not about the access to capital. There's no shortage of capital. Actually, the opportunity is to take some of the very great work that's already going on out there on the ground and get projects up at an investment scale and find ways to monetize the benefits of environmental services in a way that then get those projects to investment readiness and create the clarity for an institutional investor around where a return might lie from that project. Paul's going to talk in a minute about a very good specific example of what is of a project that is on that very pathway in our patch. So the opportunity is to use government funding and for a water company to use the delivery of our regulated obligations in a way that actually accelerates that pathway. And we see, as Ian has already said, the opportunity in 3 of our catchments in the Wessex region to take our regulated obligations and deliver them to deliver nature-based solutions, and in the Bristol Avon catchment to work with partners to create a catchment market that will deliver better outcomes for the environment as a whole, and by targeting nature-based projects at the areas of maximum environmental value, enable us to quantify and value and generate credits for the environmental services that flow from those nature-based projects. So in conclusion, I think that business can provide a very important and progressive role to accelerate nature's recovery. And indeed, I think it's absolutely imperative that business and the private finance and community find ways and models to support and strengthen the business case for accelerating nature recovery. And we at Wessex Water look forward to working with our partners in the region to get up a series of demonstration projects to actually demonstrate what that pathway will look like in practice. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Guy, for a thought-provoking and a slightly different angle on accelerating nature recovery. We've already heard today about the importance of agricultural land and how 70% of our land in the west of England is actually agricultural. And I'm delighted to hand over to Paul Cottington from the NFU. Thank you, Paul.
Hi there. So yeah, I'm Paul Cottington from the National Farmers Union. I work across the southwest and I lead on all things environment, land use and planning, and have done for about 13 years or so. And I came across to this role, slight tangent, thinking I was going to just be, I came from having written the Rural Development Programme in the Southwest, so in the previous RDA, thinking I was going to be involved in doing birds and bees and butterflies, where kind of very similar to Guy, I started my career in as an ecologist with a wildlife trust down in Kent. And actually what I've been doing mostly since has been around water quality and soils, and more recently around, other than kind of things like schemes and whatever else, around what it is to try and develop new approaches to delivering nature recovery. And funnily enough, Guy said, there is stuff that the NFU is doing. Guy was intimating towards private markets and things like that. And funnily enough, I wasn't going to speak about those quite so much, but it's actually very germane that I do, and very right that I do, because well, kind of as a starter for 10, one, how can farming help deliver nature? It has been and always will be a key part of what farming is about. So obviously farmers deliver food security and they deliver agriculture, but up until a few years ago, about 70 or so % of all farm holding or all farm land was in an environmental scheme. So farmers are very keen to do nature. And actually in a survey that we put out just before the lockdown began, we asked farmers about designated areas, things like AONBs and SSSIs, and the response was 86% of farmers saw delivering nature and the environment as a priority for their farming practice. So it was the top equal priority along with improving productivity, and both those things go together. To link back to what Guy was saying, we are very committed to trying to find new ways of enabling farmers and agriculture as a whole to be involved in delivering nature in an effective and efficient way. So the example for us, and it's a partnership where we've been working very closely with Wessex Water for a couple of years or so, is we're at the beginning phase of doing investment readiness for a nutrient management scheme or nutrient trading scheme across Poole Harbour. So that's an area which is 810 kilometres squared, something like 548 farm holdings. And the aim is to put all of those farms, or bring all of those farms in a voluntary way to do nutrient accounting and to essentially score themselves and put themselves against a threshold in the same way you might do for carbon. And where they're above that threshold, they essentially have some credits. And the aim is that over time that the targets will get tighter and tighter, and there will have to be more efficiencies on farm. And the good thing about doing this is what we're trying to do is be non-pejorative. We're not trying to say certain parts of the countryside or a catchment need to be a certain way. What we're saying is those who have the most efficient farms for delivering certain types of things, whether it's agricultural commodities or whether it's environment, will be naturally led towards doing that. So some of the things that will help encourage farms to be more commodity based is where they've got lots of investment in infrastructure. Where those farms, farms might be more leaning towards doing things that are more nature based, then that might be where they're, what would traditionally be called more marginal pieces of land, and don't have quite the same investment in infrastructure and things. And so they will be perhaps incentivized to deliver a new type of thing. So we're on a path towards trying to find, as Guy said, investors, private investors. We'll be making a business case, and I'm going to leave you with, I think, well, there are three key things that we see as being important. One, you need to have rules. So you need to have rules between all of those people, the key operators of these systems, so they know how they're functioning between each other and what to expect of each other. You need tools. So you need to have, well, in our case, having nutrient accounting tools, but also trading platforms whereby farmers can interact between themselves, but with other markets like water company or developers. And three, you must have roles. So you must be clear about what it is you're doing. So folk like the Environment Agency are able to be well expressed with what they do around their regulatory role, farmers around what it is for them to be a deliverer. And the final bit I'll kind of put in before I hand over is we must also be aware of the risks within all of this. So we're doing all of these things at a time where there is a lot of optimism, I would say, but we have massive changing systems. So we have got, we're moving away from common agricultural policy, and we're moving towards a system where farmers actually don't know where they're going to get their support. And it should be remembered that currently 16% of farms are not viable. They're making a loss even with basic payment scheme. And another 42% of farms would have been making a loss if they didn't have basic payment scheme. So we're moving towards a system where farmers and agriculture is always volatile, but they need confidence in what they're doing. And actually, many of them do see delivering nature and new markets as a very positive way to go. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul, for a very thought-provoking session. And now delighted to introduce our last panel member, and apologies for the mix-up earlier, Jess. This is Jess David, who is the member for biodiversity at Bath. Over to you.
Thanks very much. So I'm here as councillor for Moorlands Ward in Bath and North East Somerset, which is a ward on the south of the city, including some wonderful open spaces as well as some very boggy patches. I'm the council's advocate for biodiversity, and in this role I work closely with our cabinet member for climate emergency, Councillor Sarah Warren. And in my day job I spent many years working for the Environment Agency up until 2018. So I want to suggest 3 important areas where I think local government can help to contribute to accelerating local nature recovery. Firstly, I'm sorry, I can hear a child crying in the background. Firstly, getting the right evidence in place. Secondly, making real improvements to the places that we have. And thirdly, and most importantly, showing leadership to do more. So firstly, on evidence, local government needs to know about the state of nature around us. So how much space we have in our local authority area for nature to flourish, and how rich is that space. We need to think about what we know about the diversity as well as the abundance of different species. So the Prime Minister recently announced that he has an ambition for 30% of the country to be protected for nature in 2030. This is really good, but we also need to think about the quality of this space. And it was interesting to hear in the first presentation today about the number of native trees in Britain compared to Germany. So the West of England Nature Partnerships work and also the Bristol Environmental Records Centre is so important in this, helping us to understand the state of the local environment through mapping green and blue spaces, and now creating the Nature Recovery Network map, which helps local authorities to identify opportunity areas for improvement. So local government needs to support this work and also make sure that we make use of it in our own green infrastructure strategies and keep these plans up to date. These need to become real delivery frameworks, setting out what we will improve and where. And as has been discussed earlier, we also need more evidence on the value of the natural environment to other council service areas, showing how good quality green and blue spaces support health by promoting physical activity and also mental well-being. And anything that we can do in partnership to quantify these benefits and share this evidence is helpful, as this will help us to bring in resources and enable us to deliver more. The second area I wanted to talk about for local government is making those real quality improvements to the local spaces that we have. So despite the rhetoric around environmental considerations slowing down the planning process, there is a real opportunity to improve the local environment through planning decisions. In Baines, we will be developing new local planning guidance on how biodiversity net gain is to be applied, and this will help to ensure that developments contribute to the Nature Recovery Network, working in partnership with organisations like the Wildlife Trust. As part of this, we will be looking at how we can increase the percentage of net gain beyond that suggested in the new Environment Bill of 10%. Councils also have to make sure that money is allocated for improving green infrastructure networks through planning, whether that's through Section 106 agreements or community infrastructure levy contributions. And then secondly, councils also have opportunities to accelerate nature recovery through council services. Much like the climate emergency, every decision that local government makes and every service area has a relevance to the natural environment. And so in Baines, we're reviewing all council service areas to find opportunities to contribute to reviving the environment and to increase the use of nature-based solutions. This would include areas like flood risk management, where we are already working in partnership with the Bristol and Avon Rivers Trust to plant trees as part of natural flood management. It will also include public health, promoting active travel and improving the quality of our parks, highways and green spaces, and working to increase resilience to climate change. So the third and possibly most important area is showing real leadership on nature recovery. So Bath and North East Somerset has recently acknowledged the ecological crisis by declaring an ecological emergency with support from the Wildlife Trusts. This was an important declaration, recognising that despite decades of good work on the environment, what is needed now is determination to reverse the trend of decline that we've seen over the last 50 years and move towards habitat restoration and nature recovery in all that we do. Declaring this emergency hasn't changed everything overnight, but I believe it's a really important marker and a commitment of our intention to act urgently. And importantly, it also means that the Council is held to account publicly on all the decisions we now make. So as well as this sort of leadership, I believe that local government can also work in partnership to explore other ideas for how we can support nature recovery and innovation. As we've seen in the news today, Prince William has just announced the Earthshot Prize, which aims to generate new technologies and support innovation around climate, energy, nature and biodiversity. So one question that we could consider today is what can we do across the WENP network to support people and projects that will help us to answer the environmental challenges that we faced in the west of England. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jess, and it's very exciting to hear what's happening in Bath. I think now we're going to move to our full panel, who I hope are going to become visible to us all. I think Ian's going to join us in a moment. And I have actually got a question for you, Guy, if you're able to become visible. Wonderful. So my start question for you from Rachel Williams from Natural England is, what do you think the nature sector might need to do differently in order to accelerate nature recovery? So this is really, I think, about what the nature sector needs to be doing differently.
I think it's fundamentally about accepting that the current there's two parts to it. I mean, I think my fundamental diagnosis, Selina, is that the current mix of regulation, public funding mechanisms and private incentives for nature recovery is incoherent. Now that's just the way things have evolved over time, and there's a really exciting opportunity, I think, with the Environment Bill before Parliament to get that right, with all the experience we've had of the Climate Change Act before it, of how we interpret nationally binding targets into obligations and locally devolved outcomes that actually drive joined up delivery on the ground. So that's the first piece, is how we evolve the model. And I would say there's a massive opportunity coming away from Europe actually to do things differently in respect to how we interpret top-down prescriptive legislative targets. And then secondly, it's about the money and the reliance on public funding mechanisms, I think, is unsustainable. It was unsustainable, I would argue, before the pandemic and probably even before the global crash before that. And the evidence for that is, we're all too familiar with, is you know, we saw it again in the up-to-date figures on the quality of river bodies published last week. We're flatlining on the majority of our environmental targets. So to secure that additional investment will require the nature sector to up its game, and I see great evidence that this is already taking place in respect of its ability to be commercial, to be entrepreneurial, to embrace new mechanisms and new models that get us off that treadmill of grant funding and public funding mechanisms as the sole source of funding to deliver nature recovery measures on the ground.
Thank you. Ian, I don't know if you would like to comment as a part of the nature sector, and then perhaps Jess, I'll ask you what you would like the nature sector to be doing for you.
Sorry, Selina, I missed the question in trying to get on.
What does the nature sector need to be doing differently in order to accelerate nature recovery? And that's a question from Rachel Williams from.
Okay, yeah. So I think, and there's two answers to that. One is that we need to keep on doing the things we've already been doing. So, you know, looking after nature reserves, which are the last havens for some of our remaining wildlife across the west of England and the country, is really important. Those are the areas that we can use for wildlife to recolonize the rest of the landscape. And we've been working for years on a landscape scale. So on the North Somerset levels and moors, in the Chew Valley, in areas right the way across the west of England, we work with farmers, landowners to help to bring wildlife back on a large scale. So we need to keep on doing all of those things. And the 30-30-30 campaign is about getting substantially more resources in to enable us to do more of that, because we know where we do those things, it works. So we've got lapwing back in the Gordina Valley for the first time in 20 years because of the changes in the management that we've put in place there. And there's similar stories up and down the country of where the Wildlife Trust has been able to bring wildlife back. So we need to keep doing what we've always been doing, and we need to grow the support for that, and get more of the funding in. But Guy's absolutely right that that's not going to solve everything itself. So the opportunities now with nature-based solutions, with carbon offsetting, with net gain for biodiversity, all of these other sources, we need to be really tuning into them and making the most of these opportunities, and not just for the environmental NGO sector. I mean, as Paul said, farmers are seeing this as a potential way that you can really bring together what we need to in land management to deliver for nature, and to deliver livelihoods in the countryside, which is obviously really important.
Jess, what would you like to see from the nature sector in terms of supporting your role in the council?
I think, I mean, we already see a good deal of support, so I think more of the same. The key areas for me is the information and spelling out of the opportunity areas. So, where councils can help by working in partnership to improve nature. So particularly with the nature recovery map that we were talking about earlier on, resources like that councils can easily pick up and use. I think helping us to formulate partnerships, and it's been interesting today to talk about the role of the private sector as well. And also just repeatedly spelling out the obvious on why all of this is so important and holding local government to account.
Thank you. And Paul, would you like the nature sector to do anything differently from your perspective?
Do you know what? The first thing that kind of occurs to me, and it's kind of a simple one, and it is probably there for an awful lot of folk, is just get the language right. Farmers really, and the sector as a whole, really enjoys doing all of this kind of thing, and it needs to be asked in the right way, and it's kind of and it's speaking to them, to the sector, in the language of the fact that these are often they're small family businesses. They have to be viable. People aren't preternaturally driven to not having nature on their farms. And the majority of all farmers I know want to have as much nature as possible on their farms. They just got to be able to do it within the context of having a viable business. So it's being able to speak in the right language in order to enable them to feel empowered, and actually that's the right choice for what they want. I mean, I see the world as there's three different drivers, certainly for farmers, and they are their ethics, and that's the information you hold, the regulations and contracts and money incentives. And it is kind of getting that right balance. It's enabling the sector to be able to use those three things as tools to get action for nature.
I'm just going to pick up some of the questions now in the chat box. So I think the first is for you, which is about if we're going to have pristine waterways, can we expect an end to combined sewer overflows?
Yeah, so it's a topical one and a totally understandable one. And I think it just goes to illustrate the point, I guess, the generic point I'm making, which is to get solutions to these really complex, interdependent problems, we need to mobilize on a range of fronts. There's no kind of quick fix, no silver bullets. So I think, to answer the question, I think the short answer is I think it's unlikely that we'll see an end to combined sewer overflows in the short term. But to tackle the problem requires us to mobilise on a range of different fronts. We can look at the problem itself requires long-term investment in the infrastructure, because these are stranded Victorian assets that clearly no longer serve the way in which we the pressures of our modern existence on that infrastructure. So we need to find new ways of investing in the long-term issue, which nationally, by the way, totals I think something upwards of £60 billion to fix. We need to find ways of disconnecting surface water drainage from the foul systems, and we need to find ways of reducing the pressures of that surface water on the system in the first place. We've talked already about the investment in, for example, nature-based solutions as a way of addressing some of these issues around surface water drainage and flood mitigation. And there are also issues for ourselves in relation to our behaviour change. We need to tackle the wet wipe issue, for example, and that's about raising awareness and people understanding the impacts of those on the natural environment. And then lastly, there's an issue about the incremental urban creep, which is kind of building the pressure, the overload on these systems in the first place. So no quick fix, I'm afraid, Selina. It requires a holistic approach.
Much. I think, Paul, the next question is for you, which is the incentives for farmers to engage with nature restoration.
I think that probably, I sort of was pushing towards that just now. I mean, it's understanding the drivers for what is going to get farmers to go. So, I mean, the three kind of key ones are around regulations, around the finances, and around the kind of their viewpoint. I mean, the other incentives to making it all work are, having a simple system that farmers can operate in, where you haven't got too much bureaucracy. Having incentives also include things like getting feedback for what you're doing, because an awful lot of farmers have entered into schemes and, over the last 20 or so years, and I know this particularly on Dartmoor, where I do an awful lot of work, where people are not so keen to carry on doing schemes into the future because they just have never been told what they've been delivering through their schemes over the last 20 or so years, and they like to get feedback within it. So I think incentives come in a variety of different ways. One of the key things out of Poole Harbour, where this time, well, it was about May time last year, we went round and canvassed farmers around what they thought about having a trading scheme around nitrates. We had 99% of all farmers supported the idea of doing something, and that amounted to 75% of the land area. The one person who didn't sign up to it because he didn't think that we would get everyone else to sign into the whole scheme. And the thing that really worked for them most was because they were wanting to control and own the system. Yeah, they wanted to have agency within what they were doing, because so often these systems seem to be designed not with farmers in mind, i.e. you have a computer screen or a piece of software which works really well for a regulator but needs to work in a field for a contractor. So incentives look different in different ways, but maybe a key thing is that is something that actually works for them and thinks about them.
Thank you. Some really interesting points in about feedback and evaluation and understanding what's worked for nature. I think we've got time for one quick question, and I think probably this is for Jess and Ian. What are the incentives to build living walls and green roofs? Are there any financial incentives? What other incentives can there be for building?
I think we've answered that one in the chat, Selina. There aren't any, but it's a good thing to do and increases the energy efficiency and other
Is that
things in your
something
house.
one could do at local level, Jess? Building incentives?
Jess, you're on mute.
It's certainly something that we can have policies that help to promote through the local plan, and I think that's something that certainly Baines' existing local plan does do. But the challenge is always to find developers that are up for that challenge and willing to put the money in to do it. So I think where we can work in partnership to incentivise it, perhaps as local authorities, that is really important.
Okay, well, I think that's all from our panel for now. So thank you all very much for taking the time and effort to come and talk to us and give us your vision. It's been fantastic. And I think I will just move now into making a few closing remarks so that we can finish at 5 as planned. So first of all, a big thank you for all of you who have come today and all of you who've stuck with us using the new technology that, as you can see, for some of us, it's the first time we've used it. A big thank you to Bristol Natural History Consortium for their support and help in doing this, and a massive thanks for Stuart Gardner, both Stuarts actually, who've really worked incredibly hard to do this. So I hope you found it an interesting and stimulating event. I think it's really brought home to us that we need to take action at a personal level over the spaces we manage, whether that's a window box or a drive or a garden, or if we're in an organisation, perhaps a bigger patch of land. But I think it also highlights how we need to work collaboratively together to really produce change at scale. I think many of us in lockdown have really learnt to appreciate the changing seasons in a new way. I heard this week from Michael Connors from Natural Academy about the Japanese view of the world of consisting not just of 4 seasons, but actually of 72 micro seasons. So now in Japan, we would be in the season of Kanro, or cold dew season, which has little micro seasons of the wild geese return, chrysanthemums bloom, maple leaves turn and ivy turn yellow. And I think there's something really very special about that close observation and connection with nature, which some of the work that we've heard about from Ben working at community level is about reconnecting us with our nature and with the seasonality that we can lose in modern life. So I hope, having tied you to a screen all afternoon, that you will take the chance to re-engage and go outside after this. So really just big thank you for everyone. Do feedback. We will be seeking some feedback about what's worked well. We look forward to continuing working with many of you and working afresh with some of you, and seeing you at new events. So thank you very much, and goodbye.